Dan Perry is the former Europe, Africa, and Middle East editor for the Associated Press, joining us live from Tel Aviv. First of all, your response to the Council adopting this resolution, but also Linda Thomas-Greenfield's comments there to the member nations.
I mean, I agree with her that it is a disgrace that the Council seems to have such difficulty condemning one of the most vile acts of terrorism that I've ever heard of. But look, the resolution is hard to argue with. I mean, there is clearly dissonance between the American support for Israel's goals in this operation and American dissatisfaction with the fact that whatever are Israel's tactics on the ground and from the air have led to such a humanitarian disaster in Gaza, have led to the deaths of clearly well over 10,000 people. I mean, the numbers are somewhat in dispute, but it's horrific, have displaced 1 million people. And we're going on 2.5 months since the operation began, and Hamas is still firing rockets at Tel Aviv. So something is not working particularly well. And the nature of this resolution, the compromise, where they're calling for greater aid, not calling for a ceasefire, and the U.S. abstains, reflects it.
Why aren't more nations condemning it? What is the reason given after the atrocities that we have seen with our own eyes?
There are two reasons for that. For sure, almost any plausible person in the world would condemn the specific actions of Hamas on October 7th, which were a global historic pogrom and the most murderous day against Jews since the Holocaust. But some believe that the issue must, when a political statement is made, take context into account. And right now there are two versions of context. One is that Israel's response to that atrocity has killed so many people and still not dislodged Hamas. And the other is that, I mean, Israel's actions in the West Bank for the past decades, the occupation of the West Bank, the settlement of the West Bank, are seen by many countries in the world as a version of oppression against the Palestinians. Some have compared it, I think falsely, but not implausibly, to apartheid. And so the idea is that a people oppressed sometimes lash out in unadmissible, unacceptable, and barbaric anger, but the context is important. That's basically the reason. Of course, some people would argue that anti-Semitism is at play as well, and I'll leave it up to the viewers to decide whether that's a factor or not.
Right, indeed. U.S. abstaining from this resolution, what message does that send?
It sends a message to Israel that the U.S. does want more humanitarian aid sent to Gaza, and that the U.S. is fundamentally dissatisfied with the fact that there has been this level of destructive violence visited upon the Palestinian civilian population of Gaza without the military success that the U.S., I do believe, had hoped for, which would have been for Hamas to be clearly, visibly dislodged from Gaza by this point, as I say, 2.5 months into this affair. Instead, just yesterday, Marnie, I mean, we were spending a long, nervous moments in the shelter while 30 rockets exploded over my head in Tel Aviv.
Right. And at the same time, the situation in the Red Sea has gotten worse with the Houthi attacks on some of these cargo ships. The U.S. has talked about this coalition of nations. How soon do we see that have an impact and send the message it's intended to send to the Houthis and other proxies of Iran?
I think it could come relatively quickly. It's not that complicated to bombard strategic Houthi locations and Aden and other critical Yemeni locations on the Bab el-Mandeb, which controls essentially acts as the Suez Canal. You have to remember, we're talking about somewhere between 12 and 14% of global maritime trade that this Houthi militia could potentially impede. Now, if they succeed in doing that, you're looking at massive supply chain difficulties around the world, the entire world. Inflation, again, affecting Americans and Europeans, and it's unacceptable. So I would expect them to act quickly. One potential impediment is that Saudi Arabia, Yemen's neighbor to the north, is not that eager for resumption of the war that was highly inconvenient and rather unsuccessful for them, and that sort of ended in a truce in 2022.
Yeah, and how all this impacts oil prices. Meantime, Dan, reports that the International Red Cross is delivering controversial stipends from the Palestinian Authority to imprisoned Palestinian terrorists. Israel argues that this is an economic incentive to commit murder. They say pay for slay. What is the Red Cross saying in response?
The Red Cross basically says that it does what it can for prisoners everywhere. And so it feels it must do this for the prisoners. You mentioned the bigger controversy in Israel is that they see this as being non-reciprocal because the Red Cross has had no access to, at this point, 140 some hostages remaining in Gaza, including a whole bunch of Americans, Canadians, Portuguese, Russians, Romanians. I mean, many nationalities, mostly dual Israeli nationalities with that, are in Gaza, and the Red Cross has had no access whatsoever. And they say, the Red Cross does, that they always handle these things discreetly and don't make a big public noise. But the fact is, in the past, they certainly have where they thought that would work. In Colombia and in other parts of areas around the world where they thought that terrorist militias holding hostages might be influenced by public pressure, they've been not so timid as to say nothing. And Israel, at least, feels that the Red Cross has sort of let the side down by doing very little in public to pressure Hamas to have access to these hostages in Gaza, who, as I say, include Americans.
Yeah, as they say, Israel, that the Red Cross is being complicit. Dan Perry, as always, thank you.